This is exactly what we expected. No, it's not. This isn't exactly what you expected because I don't even think Jerry Jones knew definitively for sure until the last maybe few days that even he was going to go in this direction.
Welcome to the NFL on Fox podcast presented by Verizon, the NFL powered by Verizon 5G. I am your host, Dave Helman. Doesn't it feel like it always happens this way in the NFL? It's only been 24 hours since our last episode, and it already feels like there's too much to keep up with in this league. For starters, we had another playoff game, Monday Night Football, Phoenix, Arizona, Rams, Vikings, relocated on account of the LA wildfires, and the LA Rams, in convincing fashion, punched their ticket to the divisional round of the playoffs. We finally have our last 8 teams over in the NFC. We knew this one already, but the Saturday night matchup right here on Fox, Tom Brady, Kevin Burkhardt on the call as the number 1 seed Lions. They took this weekend off, but they are back. They will host Jaden Daniels and the Washington Commanders on Saturday night, early on Sunday now. After that win against the Vikings, the LA Rams will travel cross country to face the Philadelphia Eagles. Dynamite matchups in the NFC. I'm sorry, though, they might not be as good as the flip side of the bracket. It's a loaded divisional round early on Saturday. The defending champion Kansas City Chiefs try to get their three-peat going. They also got the weekend off, but they're back in a rematch against Houston from that Saturday game we saw just a few weeks ago, right before Christmas. And then, of course, the last one, late game, Sunday. One of them will be MVP, if I had to guess. Lamar Jackson, Josh Allen, Bills, Ravens. I don't need to say a whole lot else. One of the bigger playoff matchups I can remember, not counting Super Bowls, in a long, long time. It looks incredible. That's not it, though. And don't worry, we're going to dive into Rams Vikings. We got plenty to say about a startling performance from Sam Darnold and an incredible effort from a Rams team that had a very difficult week out here in Los Angeles. We're going to get to all of that in a little bit with Carmen Vitali of FoxSports.com. But that's just the beginning, because also on Monday, early Monday, word leaked out, and we can't even say that the Dallas Cowboys fired Mike McCarthy, because that's too normal. That's what everybody does. You fire or hire a head coach. No, Mike McCarthy's contract was expiring on Tuesday, and word got out Monday that they will part ways, a parting of ways between the Cowboys and Mike McCarthy, their head coach of the last 5 years. So the most visible head coaching job in the NFL now becomes the most recent opening in this year's hiring cycle. It felt worthy of a separate conversation. So we brought in a good friend of mine, Jon Machota of The Athletic, stopped by the show to talk all things McCarthy and Jerry Jones, how the Cowboys' job stacks up, how optimistic Cowboy fans should be about the Cowboys filling that job. Really great conversation with Jon. Also dove into the other coaching news, touched on it on Sunday, didn't go into it in a lot of detail. So Carmen Vitali and I also talked about the New England Patriots' decision to hire a familiar face in Mike Vrabel, obviously a franchise legend there in New England, will now become their head coach. So an episode with plenty of coaching news. And if all that wasn't enough, we also went over some of the biggest winners and losers from Wild Card Weekend, some of our favorite and least favorite performances from the first few games of the playoffs. It is a loaded episode. I'm really excited for it. Let's jump right in. And to wrap up this wild card weekend, we had one more game on Monday night. The LA Rams were temporarily displaced by the LA wildfires. They played the Minnesota Vikings out in Phoenix, Arizona, in what turned into, I'm going to call it a shockingly one-sided affair. The Rams winning, not overly surprising in my opinion, but they pantsed the Minnesota Vikings 27-9, game that felt over well before halftime started. To break it all down, we're joined now, as we often are on Tuesdays, by Fox Sports reporter Carmen Vitali. And Carmen,
I just had a flashback to like my teenage years
because I said pantsing. That's what it felt like. Okay,
you're right.
Let's talk about this.
Okay,
if you don't remember middle school,
or you're just too young to have been alive during this.
When I was in school,
there you go.
It was a good bit of
man.
It was a good bit of hijinks. I really do sound old. It was
a good bit of hijinks. Pants. Who are you?
Can you just let me do this?
No, not really.
It was a fun, goofy prank to play on somebody, to sneak up behind them and yank their shorts down so that they had their underwear exposed.
Important context is also to note that you went to an all-boys school.
Did that not happen everywhere else?
I mean, it did, but you got in a lot more trouble when there were co-eds around.
This is taking a turn I did not expect. But it used to be a thing. Like, people would do that to kids when you were young.
No, I've heard it. Yes, absolutely.
It was a fun way to just shockingly embarrass somebody. And that's what happened here. The Minnesota Vikings walked into State Farm Stadium,
stick with it, people.
14-3, feeling like the big bad wolf. They barely lost the most competitive division in football.
Yeah.
One of the best records in the NFL. Sam Darnold has played like an MVP at times this year. Yeah. You got this ferocious defense that's gotten a takeaway in every game. Yada, yada, yada. They got pantsed because the Rams just kicked their ass.
They did. No qualms about it. The Rams they scored 3 points in the entire second half, and this game was never in question.
I don't think it's fair, and I said this on social media during the game. It sucks to say Sam Darnold turned into a pumpkin and the Vikings, it was all just fake. It didn't matter. The Vikings weren't actually good. I don't know. I don't think that's fair or right.
Okay. I was going to say, where are you going with this? Because I don't think that's true.
I don't think it's true either. They were too dominant all year long. Darnold delivered in too many clutch moments for them across the season. Having said that, if that was your opinion after this game, what could I do to dissuade you? Because here's the thing. Here, let's boil it down. Sam Darnold sacked 9 times. It ties an NFL record for the playoffs.
Yes.
6 of those came in the first half. On the first 5 Vikings possessions, Darnold got sacked somewhere in there. He got sacked twice on one of them. Just could not buy a play. Could not buy. And I don't even want to say he couldn't buy time in the pocket, Carmen, because here's the crazy thing. He had time.
Yeah.
Sam Darnold had more than 2.5 seconds to throw on 80% of his dropbacks per Next Gen Stats. 28 out of 35 times he had time to stand in there and throw. And that's where I want to highlight Rams defensive coordinator Chris Shula.
Yeah.
He just made life living hell on Sam Darnold, who has been legitimately good for so much of this season. It didn't look like he knew what he was looking at all night long.
It's funny because it seems as though the Rams followed the same blueprint that was set for them by the Detroit Lions last week in that Week 18 game, which Aaron Glenn, defensive coordinator for the Lions, sold out on the blitz and making Sam Darnold uncomfortable because of all the injuries that Detroit has sustained on the defensive side of the ball. He really didn't have a choice. And so he said, instead of trying to cover Justin Jefferson, TJ Hawkinson, Jordan Addison, all of this offensive talent the Vikings have, he just decided to make Sam Darnold uncomfortable so the ball never came out in the first place. And then I have to imagine Chris Shula watches that game and is like, oh, bet. I've got all these really young and hungry guys on my defensive line that are just going to go after him. And sure enough, getting to Sam Darnold that many times that early, Sam Darnold never recovered. It was that pick in the second quarter. And after that, I thought that there might be a glimmer of hope, given that this just happened to Sam Darnold and the Vikings the week before, that maybe after halftime, he could pull it together. They could give him some more easy throws, easy plays, lean a little bit more on the run game. But credit to the Rams, they adjusted right back. Aaron Jones couldn't do much in that second half whatsoever. And then you still kept the pressure on Sam Darnold. He never recovered.
Let's talk about that too, because that's what makes this. And look, I'm not a Vikings fan. I don't have stake in this game, but it felt sad to watch.
It did.
Because it was a total collapse of one guy specifically. I mean, the Vikings had other problems, the Rams ran the ball fairly well in this game.
Very well against what's supposed to be a very good rushing defense.
It's all about Sam Darnold, though. And to your point, like, they were trying to scheme up easy stuff for him.
Yes.
He could not.
Wasn't seeing it. He wasn't getting the ball to the correct places, even on the easy throws. There were a couple to Aaron Jones, swing passes to Aaron Jones that he couldn't connect on.
He just looked like he was trying to aim the ball rather than just trust that he could put it where he wanted to put it. I don't know that I've ever seen anything like it. I've seen a lot of bad quarterback performances. I've seen quarterbacks melt down where they're trying to press and just make things happen. You see that happen all the time.
Right. Especially you being a Cowboys beat reporter for 10
years. Dak Prescott does it in big moments all the time. Jordan Love did it in the play in the Eagles game on Sunday.
Yeah.
This was something different. This was a total collapse of confidence, of trust.
What was so interesting to me, too, is it then permeated through the rest of the offense. I mean, you have Brian O'Neill go down and he doesn't return to the game. He's being evaluated for a concussion. And I feel like once that injury happened, everybody stopped trying, even Kevin O'Connell, which was really jarring to see. They weren't going hurry up. They weren't going tempo. They weren't trying. There was no sense of urgency out of the Minnesota Vikings during the entire fourth quarter, if not before.
Oh. This game, I mean, you're right. All of that is true, but man, I didn't get the vibes after halftime that the Vikings were ever in this. And there's two moments. Let's make sure I want to highlight it because it's the game swinging play. It was only 10-3. The Vikings still had fight in them. There was that weird Matthew Stafford intentional grounding that might have been a fumble that didn't wind up mattering.
Looked like a fumble.
One play is the strip sack, obviously. Let's highlight that. Chris Shula, a phenomenal play where he literally dropped Jared Verse and another down lineman into coverage, replaced them with a blitzing DB in Akello Witherspoon. So you still have four guys coming at Darnold. Witherspoon gets home, strips him, and Jared Verse, who dropped into basically a spy position, standing right there to recover it. Just a gorgeous call by Chris Shula. It leads to a touchdown return.
You know what it reminded me of?
What's that?
What Brian Flores does all of the time. I mean, that kind of simulated pressure is absolutely diabolical, and it will absolutely mess with a quarterback's head when you think the pressure is coming from one place, it's coming from another. That changes the math on so many different things. It froze Sam Darnold, which we knew he was prone to already, and it was basically Chris Shula saying to Brian Flores, yeah, I can do this too.
From there, the Vikings had one last shot, 4th and 2, midfield. I don't blame Kevin O'Connell for going for it because it felt like this thing was on the brink.
I liked that decision to go for it.
Sam Darnold did not
takes the sack.
Did not trust, did not have anything he saw. He gets sacked on a 4th down at midfield, which is just insane. 5 plays later, the Rams are in the end zone, and it really it felt like the second half was a formality, and it turns out that it was. So real quick before we move on to the rest of the show. Rams move on. Obviously, we knew that they would be going to Philadelphia. They play the Eagles Sunday. Fascinated to see how they rebound from getting just destroyed by Saquon Barkley earlier this year. That'll be fascinating. And then the Vikings, all of a sudden, the Sam Darnold conversation is still interesting, but for different reasons.
Right.
Because a month ago it was, can you afford to keep him? Do you want to afford to keep him? What does this mean for JJ McCarthy?
Yeah. What would his value be in the trade market? All that other stuff.
I don't want to exaggerate. Sam Darnold will still have suitors. He will still have value.
Yeah.
He still had a good season. But these last 2 games,
recency bias is a hell of a thing.
And it's not just recency bias either. It's completely coming up short in pivotal moments. I mean, you're talking about a playoff game and a regular season game that has as big of stakes as you could ask for.
As it could have had,
Came up, to say he came up short is underselling it. And so now, how does that affect your market? How does that affect your asking price? Could he wind up back in Minnesota because this affects other people's opinions of him so much? It's too early to know the answer to that, but it's not the conversation I expected to be having. Even if the Vikings had lost early, it's not what I expected to see after so many good games from Sam Darnold.
Well, and I also think that while it weakened the case for Sam Darnold as a starter for a potential whatever, it strengthened Kevin O'Connell's case for Coach of the Year. Because if you were able to get so much out of a guy that clearly still has a lot of issues when it comes to big moments, big games, pressure situations, all that kind of stuff, if you were able to get 14 wins with a team captained by Sam Darnold, who many had given up on, and had really had, he still had a career resurgence. He still proved that he can be a good quarterback. But at the end of the day, I think that a lot of this had more to do with Kevin O'Connell than it really did with Sam Darnold being fixed or cured or however you want to classify it. But I do want to say, before we move off of this game, how incredible this week was for the Los Angeles Rams.
You're right. It's absolutely worth highlighting.
The amount of uncertainty that was present for the Rams between where they were playing this game, when they needed to get out, the fact that their families came with them, the Cardinals sent planes for them, they turned their stadium into the Rams' house, which is their division rival. But the Rams having all of that upended, all of that concern, all of that worry for the people that were still left in Southern California and the wildfires, the homes, just the neighborhoods, the people affected, and then for them to go what was essentially on the road when they were supposed to be home, put out a performance like that. They left no uncertainty on the field. It was dominant in all three phases, and I'm so happy for them as an organization, for those guys as players, for those guys as coaches, to overcome what they did this week and continue to play a football game. It's incredible.
Not only that, and it is an incredible response to a traumatic situation. And the Rams practice up near where the Palisades fire was taking place.
There was another fire that broke out while they were at practice
near their facility. A lot of those guys live up there. But on top of that, remember too, the Rams started the season 1-4. This felt like the most lost of all causes at one point in the season. Actually, right around the time they welcomed the Vikings to SoFi Stadium, they were just starting to dig out of it. And now they are going to the divisional round of the playoffs, which I was going to say, Kevin O'Connell, still an incredibly deserving Coach of the Year candidate. Maybe he will win it. And I know the playoffs aren't supposed to impact these conversations. Yeah. Sean McVay was always a guy worthy of mention in that conversation.
Yeah.
And this last week just highlights it. I don't know if that's enough to get him Coach of the Year, but it's worth saying anyway. You're so right. I think the shock of the result makes you focus on the Vikings, but you can't say enough about the Rams' response here and really how well they've played over the second half of the season. And they are now onto the divisional round where, like I said, they'll get another shot at the Philadelphia Eagles. That's something to look forward to. And this is really well timed because we were going to have this conversation anyway. Sam Darnold, unfortunately, one of the bigger losers of these 2024 playoffs, but we wanted to highlight a few other ones. Teams who had a lot to gain, had a lot to lose, biggest winners and losers of these playoffs so far. So with the last of the games out of the way, we wanted to take this opportunity to look back at Wild Card Weekend, the classic game of winners and losers, Carm. Just look at who had the biggest weekend, who maybe had the most forgettable weekend from a full slate of games. Will you join me in determining some biggest winners and some biggest losers from the weekend?
Sure. Let's go on this take journey together.
I like that. Let's call it a take journey. And my first winner, the biggest thing that I want to highlight coming out of Wild Card Weekend is I think that it matters that the rushing renaissance showed up in meaningful games. And I think some of the biggest winners of Wild Card Weekend are the running backs.
Yes.
Because it's one thing to note this during the middle of the season and, that's Saquon Barkley's having a great year, isn't he? If it doesn't do anything when the chips are down,
right?
Who cares? This is a copycat league, and we well know that the stuff that happens over this next month are things that teams are going to try to replicate as they build their contender for next year. So tell me it doesn't matter that of the winners in Wild Card Weekend in the first 2 days, the vast majority of these teams went buck wild on the ground.
Yes.
160 rushing yards or more. Two teams, the Bills and the Ravens, went over 200 yards rushing. Baltimore basically hit 300 yards. Not normal for the NFL period, let alone against the best of the best. And of course, the biggest free agency acquisitions, you're looking at Derrick Henry right now. Even the three headliners, really.
Oh.
Derrick Henry, 26 totes for 186 and 2. Saquon Barkley, 25 and 119. And he could have had a $178 and a touchdown if he wasn't just the nicest guy. Joe Mixon, who the Houston Texans A, traded for and B, extended. He goes for 101, for 106 and a touchdown. His best day in almost 2 months against the LA Chargers. And I mentioned the other big free agency acquisition. I do want to shout out Josh Jacobs. I feel like it's going to be
good. Okay. We can talk about this in a little bit when I get to my kind of stuff, but yes, please continue.
I think it would be forgotten to history that Josh Jacobs tried his best to put the Green Bay Packers on his back. 121 total scrimmage yards. The 32-yarder to get to the goal line that was initially ruled a touchdown, a legendary playoff run. If the Packers even come close to winning this game, let alone actually winning it.
Yes.
Like, build a statue type of run. If the Packers had looked better on offense whatsoever. James Cook, 23 and 120 for a touchdown. The one team in the early couple days that really didn't do much in the run game would be the Washington Commanders.
Right.
And by the way, they had a top 5 rushing attack all season long.
Right.
Phenomenal on the ground.
Bucks did a good job shutting that down.
I'm guessing they're going to get back to their ways against the Detroit Lions. I bet you they'll have a little more success running the ball. I think it matters to see this show up when the chips are down.
Can I push back on you just a tiny bit?
No. Yeah, obviously. Go ahead.
I think you're on to, I want to have more of these kinds of conversations about just kind of the evolution of the league in general and how we're seeing the dividends from an evolved run scheme that more often than not now includes somewhat of a mobile quarterback who can also factor into this, that stresses defenses in ways that they are just not built to handle right now, yada, yada, yada. But I don't want to just single out running backs for this particular conversation, because I think you need to open it up to the run game in general, which includes the big sexies up front that are allowing for this. Like I cannot pretend, as good as Saquon Barkley is, as good as Derrick Henry is on their own, I can't pretend that they are not benefiting from two of the best offensive lines in football. The Bills and James Cook, same thing. I think the Bills offensive line has gone criminally underrated this year. So when we talk about the running back renaissance, it really needs to be the run game renaissance, because what these teams are doing up front is just as vital to who they have running behind them.
Can I push back on your pushback?
Oh, all right.
Obviously, we all know the running back benefits from the work, the talent, the ability of the entire ecosystem around them, right? The offensive line. Of course, Derrick Henry is benefiting from what Lamar Jackson does to a defense, the way that changes the math, the way you key on his ability to keep the ball. Jalen Hurts and Saquon Barkley as well. Seeing teams benefit this greatly from the run game and seeing what special players can do, because I've been guilty of saying, like, any good running back can do good work behind the right attack. But I do think it matters to see what it can mean when a souped up running back plays behind a souped up offensive line. Saquon,
I agree with
Jahmyr Gibbs in Detroit.
Yeah.
You're getting better results from good situations than if you had just drafted a guy and plugged him in there.
Yeah.
And I think that matters, because I think teams are going to seek to pair talent with talent rather than say anybody can give us above average results. They say, but look what it can look like when the back is special in addition to what's around him.
Yeah, I like that, because I think for so many years, we kind of thought about this as an either or thing, where if you have a really great offensive line, then yeah, you don't need an all world running back because anybody is going to be able to run through those gaps. Now we're seeing, to your point, if you do have an all world running back and you have a really, really good rushing attack from your offensive line. That can be just as productive, just as scary, in some cases even scarier, given how defenses are built and how sophisticated they are against the pass. That is something that is kind of moving the NFL forward as far as offensive trends and offensive schemes and all that kind of stuff. It's a cyclical league. We talk about it being a copycat league, all that kind of stuff. But when these trends come back around, i.e. when the run game comes back around, it has to have an evolutionary aspect to it. And I think that right there specifically is what we're seeing works, where, all right, do you have to spend the resources on a running back on top of having a really good offensive line? Maybe not. But if you do, you are capable of doing so much more. And you are capable of keeping pace with anybody, no matter, what kind of passing attack you have, what kind of passing attack you're facing. You're capable of scoring points, because what we've seen from the top teams that run the ball as frequently as guys like the Ravens do, or even or the Buffalo Bills or anything like that, or the Detroit Lions are the best example of this. They're scoring points. There is tangible production coming from emphasizing the run game, which I think a lot of people think of the run game being a conservative way to play offense. And what teams are doing now is not.
But it's not. Exactly. Right. And that, I think I already thought this, but the rushing renaissance is here. And teams are seeing what this can do and what it will do in the playoffs and what it will continue to do, because these teams are advancing.
Yeah.
I think it's just going to fuel this even further, where, of course, Saquons and Jahmyr Gibbs don't grow on trees,
right?
But teams are going to be looking for those guys harder than they have over the last few years.
That's why I think one of my, bold predictions for this coming off season and coming season in 2025. We did an article on foxsports.com doing bold predictions. And mine was that Ashton Genty was going to go as high as top 5, but definitely top 10, because you look at his production in college and you realize with this rushing renaissance and how productive running backs can be, especially when they're surrounded by the right kind of ecosystem, they can be incredible playmaking assets, and we should be placing more of a value on that. And I think that's what we're going to start seeing.
This is a loaded running back class. Genty's just the tip of the iceberg.
Yes.
And I think
my guy Cam Scatteraboo,
Arizona State, Quinshon Judkins and Travion Henderson out of Ohio State. You can go on and on. Caleb Johnson out of Iowa. I think it's going to be reflected. I think running backs are big winners. Biggest loser, maybe I'm just complaining. I'm just complaining.
Not you.
Justin Herbert is the biggest loser coming out of Wild Card weekend, and I feel bad for the guy.
I do too.
He played really poorly against the Houston Texans. Make no mistake, but I'm severely bummed out that all year long I was down on the Chargers in the preseason.
Yeah,
I said to myself, they don't have enough weapons. Where's the skill talent? Keenan Allen and Mike Williams are gone. Austin Eckler's gone. Ladd McConkey can only do so much. I was late to embrace the Chargers because of that.
Sure.
And then ultimately they exceed expectations. They get to the playoffs despite all of that stuff still being true, by the way.
Mm.
And those problems ultimately sink them in the end. And they sink Justin Herbert, who again had a bad day, but got no help whatsoever against a ferocious Houston defense. 4 interceptions, threw a pick 6. I would argue several of those miscues had just as much to do as the guy he was throwing to. Will Dissly doing no favors for my guy, Justin Herbert.
No.
The pick 6 that really ended this game was a bad throw. It also went through Ladd McConkey's hands.
Yeah.
And
Which is uncharacteristic given how reliable Ladd McConkey had become by the end of the season.
If we know one thing, we know Ladd McConkey's a guy you can build this offense around.
Yeah.
The Chargers should be very interested in acquiring receivers, be they free agents, draft picks, preferably both. If you're listening to this, Chargers, I just hate for Justin Herbert that the narrative that followed the Chargers all season long remained true the entire time. It just wasn't enough to keep them out of the playoffs. And once they got there, it bit them in the ass. And if you don't think Justin Herbert is like a top tier quarterback, that's fine. the results indicate that you're right. But I hate that we're going to spend the next year burying this guy for a result that at the end of the day wasn't that shocking.
That's why wins aren't a quarterback stat. But that's the biggest thing for me. And I forgot who pointed this out online when I was scrolling through. But this isn't just something that can be rectified by next season, no matter what the Chargers do as far as acquiring talent or getting, more weapons for Justin Herbert, all this other stuff. This is literally going to take until the Chargers are in the playoffs next for Justin Herbert.
There's nothing he can do about it.
Right.
There's nothing he can do about
it. Shed this narrative.
He's got to play great in playoff wins with an S now.
Yes.
And look, I borrowed this stat from my guy, Sheil Kapadia of The Ringer. Out of 214 performances in the playoffs over the last decade, he had the second to worst by EPA per pass play in a decade. Like it truly was a horrendous performance. You can't get out from underneath that, but I still think he's a good player, and I think he's going to catch a lot of shit until he gets back to the playoffs.
What really
and rectifies that.
Like playoffs just have this way of making everything so black and white when it still isn't. Like we lose all sight of the fact that it takes a lot to even get into the dance in the first place. And then once teams are there, and if they get bounced in the first round, we see them as abject failures. When I don't think I'm alone in saying that the Chargers were not expected to even reach the postseason this year. The Chargers surpassed any and all expectations they had for year one under Jim Harbaugh from my eyes, and I think a lot of eyes. And I think all you have to do is look at what the Chargers did this offseason to see that they were further along than even the Chargers themselves knew. That's what kind of gets me is these shouldn't have necessarily been the expectations in general. Like winning a playoff game in year one under Jim Harbaugh should not have been the expectation. And yet they made it into the playoffs. And so then all of a sudden we have these expectations. We think they've completely done a 180 under Harbaugh from this like charging verb that we all use, justifiably so.
It's back. If it ever went anywhere, it's back.
We thought it went somewhere. It didn't. It just took a little bit longer to materialize and show itself. But the point I'm trying to make here is that this was still not a failure of a season for the Los Angeles Chargers.
You're right. And yet I think you're wrong.
No, I know. I know. But like, again, this is what playoffs do. It's like you get bounced in a vacuum. Yeah.
In a vacuum, the Chargers are ahead of schedule. But in front of a national audience, they chargered.
They did. They chargered real hard.
Their quarterback makes $52 million a year for that to not
that goes
happen.
Into that.
I don't think it's completely fair that Justin Herbert is the biggest loser. But for all of those reasons, he is. Yeah. And it's going to be a rough road for the Chargers as they work toward another chance to prove that that's not who they are.
Yeah.
But until then,
it's going to take a while.
It's
going to take a while to do that. Like, this is not a taste that's going to leave Justin Herbert or Chargers fans' mouths for a very long time.
Give T. Higgins a call when it's legal to do so, LA Chargers. When it's okay by the league rules.
Yeah, don't Charger the process, please.
When it's legal, see what T. Higgins is up to, and maybe we can fix these charging allegations. Who's your biggest winner?
I was gonna say, can we switch up some of the tone? Can we get back to some of the positives?
Let's make it happy again.
Mine is not totally cut and dry. We labeled it on the lower thirds, fourth down decisions. But my guys across the league, meaning NFL head coaches, decision makers, all that, they're putting on their big boy pants. They're growing up. We're all growing up when it comes to how we speak about fourth down decisions, analytics, all this kind of stuff.
Yes.
Because I want to get rid of going for it in short yardage, in plus territory, on fourth down as aggressive. That's not aggressive. That makes sense. And if you consider, I've got some stats to back this all up.
Hit me with the stats.
Every team that made the playoffs this year was top 10 in fourth down success rate in the regular season, except for the Buccaneers, who were 11th. So top end of the league as far as fourth down success rate. Washington, of all teams, led the league in fourth down success rate at 87%. They led the league in yards per play at 9.9 yards per play on fourth down. Ludicrous. They also led the league in EPA per play on fourth down at 2.15, which is expected points added. So 2.15 expected points added per fourth down decision. That's all absolutely insane. And you saw it happen against the Buccaneers, where they were 3 for 5 on fourth down. So it didn't always work out for them. All 5 of the times they went for it, though, and all 7 of the times they faced fourth down, they were in plus territory. So that makes sense to me. They kicked on 4th and 4 and 4th and 6. And that 4th and 4 was after the penalty, where the NGS model had the recommendation to go for it because you had been going for it from the 1 for a 2-point conversion. Instead, Dan Quinn kicked, which I think everybody knew was kind of the wrong decision. And it also just kind of went against their mentality in general on fourth down. And 4 of the 5 times they did go for it, they matched the NGS model's suggestion. So if you don't know, Next Gen Stats on the NFL will show you all the fourth down decisions that coaches made, and will make a recommendation based on down, distance, position on the field, other factors, and they'll make a recommendation whether to go for it, whether to kick the field goal, whether to do, punt, whatever it is. So 4 of the 5 times that Washington went for it on fourth down, that was in accordance to the recommendation. So all of that is to say, I've seen a lot of people label the Washington Commanders and these teams that are known for, like the Detroit Lions, like going for it on fourth down, as aggressive.
Yeah, Mike Tirico did it Sunday night.
Yes. It's not aggressive. It makes sense. It makes it disrupts the flow of the game when you have to punt all this other stuff. But like, if you consider that, if you punt the ball, we'll just say that as a particular example. Say, you're just in plus territory. You're not quite there yet. You end up punting the ball even in short yardage. Well, you have a chance to pin. But when you consider that 7.5% of all punts end in touchbacks anyway, your opponent's then starting on the 25-yard line. So when you think about when you should go for it, when you're thinking about trying to continue the drive, all that other stuff, it should be a no-brainer if you're within 25 yards of the end zone to go for it. And then even back further, if you have any trust in your defense whatsoever, sometimes punts don't even work out. You're taking a gamble either way. You might as well go for it if you're, again, on the right half of the field, in short yardage, all that kind of stuff. That's not aggressive. That just makes sense.
I mentioned Mike Tirico on purpose because I just remember, I think Washington had a 4th and short on the Tampa 23-yard line midway through this game. And it was just like a throwaway comment. He didn't do anything wrong, but Mike Tirico was like, Dan Quinn, getting aggressive here. And I was like, we don't have to bill it that way anymore. No. We do not have to bill having a mobile quarterback. And like I said earlier, one of the best run games in the NFL, an offense that is designed to pick up 1 to 3 yards. We don't have to bill that as an aggressive decision. No. It's just a sound decision. And we've got a lot of results at this point that justify it. I was so proud of Dan Quinn in particular, because this is, to your point, this is who Washington's been all year. Mm-hmm. There's a huge difference between going for it on fourth down in week 3 against the Bengals before you really know who you are and how good of a shot you have at the playoffs. There's a difference between that and going for it in the playoffs.
Right. Especially when it hasn't worked out every time.
Yeah.
That's the biggest thing.
He's a defensive-minded head coach.
Yes, who get all of the flack for being conservative guys that don't want to take risks like this.
You could argue his defensive-minded counterpart on the other side of that matchup.
A little bit more conservative, even though he likes his defense on the field. So
and Todd Bowles could have stood to maybe be slightly more aggressive in that game, and maybe the Bucs would be moving on instead. But that game came down to like 2 or 3 plays, just regardless, which these playoff games do. So you're right. Putting the ball in your quarterback's hands as often as possible, maybe not the worst decision. Who's your biggest loser?
My biggest loser, unfortunately, is the Green Bay Packers. I alluded to it before when you were talking about Josh Jacobs.
Okay.
That was, I think, the worst game of Wild Card Weekend.
It was the worst game, yes, just in terms of like entertainment value.
Entertainment value, even with the Packers only trailing 16-10 in the fourth quarter, it looked like Philly had the game in the bag. And to your point, you had guys like Josh Jacobs that on paper, and I said this going into the week too, the Green Bay Packers have everything they need to beat the Philadelphia Eagles, to upset the Philadelphia Eagles. If they play their best game, which they had struggled to do consistently throughout this season, whether it was because Jordan Love was injured or they had other injuries or things just weren't going, as you would have liked them to with the new defensive system being implemented, all this other stuff, they had struggled to find any sort of consistency. And so that was the biggest concern coming into this game for me about the Green Bay Packers was, were they going to be able to find consistency? Were they going to be able to play their game to the best of their abilities, to their capabilities? They have a great play caller. Their defense, while I think a lot of people had question marks about this defense coming into the season, coming into the postseason, that couldn't have been further from the truth over the last month of the season, given that new scheme. They made adjustments after the bye week. Green Bay started to get a lot more pressure. They were a lot more complete of a defense. They kind of figured out the roles, and credit to Jeff Hafley for making the necessary adjustments over the last month of the season too. They were tons better against the run. And going into this game against the Eagles, who you knew you were going to have to try to limit the run as much as possible against Saquon Barkley and Jalen Hurts in that offense, I thought they matched up pretty well with how they had been playing. That didn't happen.
It stings that they got as good of a game as they did from their defense.
Yes.
And didn't really ever feel like a threat to win this game.
Like, if they don't fumble that kickoff on special teams,
change the entire game.
The kickoff return, it changes the entire game. And then on top of that, you still felt like you had enough to win given performances by Josh Jacobs, which you talked about. 98 yards of his, what was it, 121?
121 total. Yeah.
I'm looking at my notes trying to see where I put this. 121 yards total. 98 of them came after contact.
Dude,
he was getting no help.
Few players in Wild Card Weekend were more impressive than the way Josh Jacobs was just creating 3 yards out of jack
Absolutely
shit.
Nothing. And I get that, this was a direct result of the fact that not one, but two offensive linemen end up getting injured for the Green Bay Packers. And on top of that, you have two receivers in both Romeo Doubs and Jaden Reed that go down. Those are your top two receivers. You were already down Christian Watson. So that changes the math on everything. But even with that, a good defensive performance, a performance like that out of your running back, if your quarterback just doesn't put the ball in harm's way, you still have a shot. Like I said, it was 16-10 going into the fourth quarter, or like right after the fourth quarter, I should say, started. So what really gets me is that when you look at Philly's game plan coming into this week, it didn't make a whole lot of sense. They sold out on coverage because the Packers have so many different guys that they can throw the ball to, whether it be tight ends, wide receivers. You've got Josh Jacobs who can come out of the backfield, catch some balls. Philly seemed to have sold out on the coverage because they only blitzed Jordan Love twice in this game. But because of the injuries and things that were actually out of Philly's control, it ended up working. And so the Green Bay Packers really just kind of beat themselves.
They absolutely did. Can I push back on you a little bit though? And
okay.
I'm going to try to be generous to the Packers the way that we just were to the Chargers. You're totally right. It was a blah game. It was one of the most disappointing performances of Wild Card Weekend, if not the most. I'm not that down on the Packers in general though. Like, okay, they're the Green Bay Packers. The expectation is championship. It's been a minute since they won the Super Bowl. All that good stuff. Like, Green Bay is just one of those teams that's never going to be happy unless they win the Super Bowl.
They're spoiled.
They're spoiled.
Yeah.
Sure. All of that said, I feel like you could see this coming. We knew, for starters, they got swept by the other two contenders in their division. Like, we had a pretty clear indicator that Green Bay was not on par with the NFC's best this year. Jordan Love dealt with an injury. I know it's starting to sound like an excuse, but this is still the youngest team in the NFL, or one of them. All of the building blocks that you're excited about for the Packers are still there.
They are. And they're under team control for still multiple years, which is the big thing here.
I think at some point that starts to wear thin, but like, if I just peel back to 30,000 feet with the Packers,
yeah, that's fair.
I'm like, you didn't show up in the playoffs, and this season was probably a disappointment relative to how exciting they looked on that run last year.
Mm-hmm.
But now that the season's over, you turn that page real quick and you're like, okay, this was year 2 for Jordan Love. Josh Jacobs was worth every penny. You know,
Xavier McKinney was worth every penny.
Xavier McKinney was
where
worth
you
every
spent
penny.
money made sense.
Disappointing year for the young pass catchers in the sense that none of them really rose up and established himself as a guy. But I still feel A-okay about where the Packers are heading. Like I said, I
PSA
bet
Packer fans, listen to Dave.
I bet you, though, that plenty of Packer fans probably don't want to hear that. Because
Right.
again, and they've had their hearts broken so many times in the postseason. It's been, from the time they won that Super Bowl, it's been one gut punch after the other once you get to the playoffs. But I'm still pretty optimistic about Green Bay while acknowledging that this was a much worse showing than I was hoping for from them.
I just think that they could, like, I root for maximum chaos, and I feel like Green Bay was primed to create maximum chaos had they, like, imagine if they had knocked out the Philadelphia Eagles, and just how, like, everything that we know about this wild card round would have just, I don't know, imploded a little bit. It would have been really fun. That's all I'm saying.
It is funny to think like that potential was there right up until the actual opening kickoff. And then you were like, oh, okay, maybe that's not going to happen. Maybe Philly's just going to win this game. So
yeah,
your point is well made. That does it for winners and losers. But hey, there's still plenty more playoff football to play. So we can always bring this back later. Appreciate it, Carm. All right, let's transition from wild card weekend to the coaching, hiring, firing cycle. We knew there was going to be more news coming out of the weekend. We knew we weren't done with coaching changes and all of that good type of stuff heading out of the weekend. I don't think I expected it to happen this quickly. Maybe that's on me, but I wake up Monday morning to discover that yes, the Cowboys and Mike McCarthy are officially parting ways. As many of us expected, it's never going to be as clean as you anticipate with the Cowboys. There was no grand announcement. Word just sort of trickled out that an agreement couldn't be reached between McCarthy, who's technically a free agent, and the Cowboys, and his tenure in Dallas is officially done after 8 days of uncertainty. It's all very peak Cowboys. And speaking of peak Cowboys, we knew we wanted to talk about this. I couldn't think of a better person to talk to immediately when the news broke. I knew I wanted to get my good buddy, my old colleague on the Cowboys beat, Jon Machota of The Athletic, joins us now to talk through all of this McCarthy news. Jon, how we doing, man? It's good to see you.
I'm good, man. Good to see you too. When you were saying that intro there, one of the things that was going through my head is just the idea of, well, of course they'll drag it out because they do that with all of their business. And we've seen it with so many of their contracts. So when that news came out last week that they turned down the Bears offer or the Bears interview of Mike McCarthy, I was like, oh, this is just the Cowboys. They're going to wait till the last day of Mike McCarthy's contract and they'll work something out. And the fact that it didn't happen and then the way things came out today, it was a little surprising. I do take a little bit of an issue with anybody that goes, this is exactly what we expected. No, it's not. This isn't exactly what you expected because I don't even think Jerry Jones knew definitively for sure until the last maybe few days that even he was going to go in this direction.
That's a really great point. And okay, so if you're not familiar with Jon's work, get familiar. He's one of the best people covering the Cowboys on a day-to-day basis. When you see Jerry Jones talking after a Cowboys game, it's Jon that's at the center of all that stuff. So you've been at the epicenter of this Mike McCarthy lame duck season all year. And man, from a distance, it started feeling around the holidays that Mike McCarthy had bought himself another year. You know, they beat Washington. They played well against Cincinnati. They arguably should have won that game. I think they finished 4-3 over their last 7. Even without Dak Prescott, he had them playing well. And like you said, they then denied the Chicago Bears the opportunity to interview McCarthy a week early. It just felt like the snowball was rolling downhill that Jerry and Stephen Jones were going to say, well, Mike kind of disappointed, but he already knows us. He knows the structure here in Dallas. Maybe we'll just run this thing back for another deal. You just said you were a little bit surprised. Do you think there's surprise on the part of the Cowboys that it didn't work out this way? Like, do you think they were expecting McCarthy to agree to a new contract, maybe a shorter contract, or maybe did they see this coming at least a few days out?
I think that I could see them thinking that he would, because obviously the Cowboys, they're a huge brand, and they know that they're going to always be somebody that wants to work there and coach them. And they probably feel like they're always going to get the benefit of the doubt. But I find it very hard to believe that they haven't had some things prepared just for the case of maybe it doesn't work out. Maybe, Mike McCarthy doesn't get or doesn't feel comfortable with what they offer. They had to have a backup plan. If they didn't, then that's just a poor working on their part. I will say during the season, to your point, with some of the things that you said about how it was going and how you felt like he'd come back, I kind of was feeling that way too, just because of the fact of not just locally, but I understand how this team is covered nationally, that if you even get a little sniff of anybody that you hear the Cowboys might have interest in, that story will get beaten to death. And we saw it for so many years with Sean Payton, and that name never emerged with the Cowboys. You've never heard anything about anybody being mentioned with the Dallas Cowboys if they move on from Mike McCarthy, and nothing at least realistic. Of course, people will throw it, Deion Sanders and Shador Sanders combo packages just for fun to kill segments. But realistically speaking, there was never any real talk of anyone else. And so that's why, as we sit here today, especially looking at some of the work my colleagues do covering other teams of the Athletic, when they put together their coaching search list, like there's at least some front runners. I don't think there's a front runner right now.
That's a really great point, and it speaks to how unique this job is. Like every other team in the league, you're going to throw the hot names out there. Ben Johnson with the Detroit Lions, both of the coordinators with Detroit, Ben Johnson and Aaron Glenn would be at the top of most hiring lists. Brian Flores in Minnesota is probably another one worth mentioning. In any given year, you can point to the hot shot coordinators, but it just doesn't feel like that's the way the Cowboys want to do things. When they fired Jason Garrett, they moved on to a proven head coach who had won a Super Bowl in Mike McCarthy. Before Bill Belichick took the North Carolina job in college football, he was probably the most linked name to the Cowboys, because if you're going to fire a guy who's won a Super Bowl, how do you follow that up? I mean, is there, and I know you just said there's no obvious name, but what line of thinking do you think Jerry Jones and Stephen Jones follow here? Because I'm with you, man. I have a hard time believing they're just going to circle a hotshot coordinator like a Ben Johnson. Even as many people want their team to hire Ben Johnson, I just don't see the Cowboys going that way. How do they approach this search?
Yeah, the thing that's funny about the Cowboys is that people are probably always beaten down and annoyed with the idea of, another Forbes list and they're worth $10 billion. Now they're worth $10.1 billion. The Cowboys don't spend like that on coaches. They're not, It's not like Mike McCarthy was making 17, 18 million like these top coaches are being paid. I mean, he was making like 7 or 8 million this last season. And so they're not going to be the highest spender when it comes to getting a coach. And so that takes names off the list. Like I'm pretty confident Ben Johnson's going to go to a team that's going to pay him a boatload of money and pay him more than what the Cowboys are willing to pay. And so because of that, there's so many names that you would just cross off for other teams. But for the Cowboys, you can't completely dismiss them. And when I say that, I'm including names like Ron Rivera, like John Gruden, like any former coach, especially if the coach has won a Super Bowl. That's why, like even a Doug Peterson, you can't 100% rule that out with the way, because again, Jerry will listen to other people, but ultimately he'll be the one that makes the decision. And so if it wasn't going to be like a former head coach and it's not going to be somebody that has any head coaching experience, I could see Jerry being as interested in Kellen Moore or Jason Witten as any of those other coordinators and trying to piece them together with Mike Zimmer as the DC and being like, well, Mike Zimmer's a former head coach. He can kind of be a guy that they can bounce ideas off of. They're a first-year coach, whoever that is. And you just can't rule any of those ideas out, where I think a lot of other organizations would be like, we're not going to give this to like a Jason Witten who's never even coached at the professional or collegiate level. But with Jerry Jones and how close he is with Jason Witten, you can't 100% count that out.
It is. I just want to pull back and admire how wild that is, that this is, I mean, we know that they've fallen short on the field. We're all aware of that. But when you talk about brand power, this is the preeminent brand in the NFL. And you can't rule out a Jason Witten, who as of right now has only coached at the high school level. I think all options should be on the table. You mentioned Ron Rivera. I think Doug Peterson is another great name. Pete Carroll is probably like the most normal name that I could come up with, just in terms of a guy that has been successful, probably wants another bite at the apple in the coaching industry, and just recently left Seattle. I mean, he was only off for 1 year. Like when you're talking about Pete Carroll being as normal as it could get, I think that's really wild, because I think everything else needs to be on the table. I mean, Deion Sanders might be pie in the sky, but I don't think you can rule it out. I'm not willing to rule out the idea that Bill Belichick says, like, oh, wait a second, I didn't know this job was actually coming open. Like, forget recruiting if I can coach the Dallas Cowboys. Like, there's not a lot you could throw at me that I'm just writing off right now. And that's a wild place to be for a coaching search.
And they might actually be in the same exact spot. There's a very good chance that they don't even know definitively right now who their top three is, that it's just going to be this, we're going to take a couple of weeks and we're going to really like look at this thing and we're going to consider all options. And it could just come down to just a good meeting that Jerry has with somebody. And all of a sudden that candidate or somebody that knows that candidate becomes the front runner for it. I will say, going on the Pete Carroll thing, let's say it was Pete Carroll. I think part of that deal you'd really have to, if you're Pete Carroll, have an OC in mind that Jerry would really like, because obviously Jerry's tied a lot of money up into Dak and CD. And so if it is a defensive coach, then who their offensive coordinator would be, I think would be a big part of that. And obviously that would be the same situation. Let's say if it was a Jason Witten or a Deion Sanders, who's going to be the one coaching my $60 million investment, my $34 million investment? Who's going to be in charge of this? Because no matter who the coach is, like, it isn't going to be trying to sell Dak on the coach. That coach has to fit Dak. Dak's not going anywhere. Dak's locked up for the next 4 years. There's a good chance Dak is with the Cowboys longer than whoever this next coach is. So that'll be a big part of it if they go the defensive route.
Let's wrap this up by just let's get down to brass tacks, man. Like, let's have an honest conversation here, because I'm curious for your take on this. I can come up with so many reasons why this is a desirable head coaching opportunity. Again, it's the most visible team in the NFL. Marketing's going to follow. Money's going to follow. Even if the Cowboys don't pay that well behind the scenes, the opportunity to make money is there. You have a nice roster. They signed Dak Prescott before the season. CeeDee Lamb is one of the best receivers in football. Micah Parsons is there. Looks like he wants to be a Cowboy for the long term eventually. I can think of half a dozen reasons why this is a good, borderline great job. I think it's one of the 2 or 3 best jobs in this hiring cycle. At the same time, all of the stuff we just listed about just what a unique opening this is. The family owns the team. They are intimately involved with everything that happens there. Jerry and Stephen Jones are always going to have a very large amount of say in everything, not just the direction of the team, but the day to day. I think I've said it all year. You and many other people have said it all year. The Cowboys hamstrung Mike McCarthy in his final year with the quality of roster that he had going into this. All of that is to say, how good of a job do you think this is? Like, do you think desirable coaching candidates should have reservations about stepping into what I think you can fairly describe as a circus?
I do think there would be a lot of interest, because to make it to the coaching level that these people are at, you believe that you're as good as anyone, if not better. And so you believe that you can fix it, that you can be the one that finally gets the Dallas Cowboys over the top. And if you do, what that means for your resume. I mean, every year that goes by now that we're approaching 30 years since they won their last Super Bowl, the idea of winning a championship or even getting to a Super Bowl with the Dallas Cowboys pretty much tops anything else. The problem is that I feel like with the Cowboys, and particularly Jerry Jones, is that he doesn't value coaching like a lot of other organizations do. That's why he says when he has Jimmy Johnson that he could find 500 other coaches that would have won a Super Bowl then. And then when he's asked after the loss to Washington 8 days ago to end the season, that there could be 500 coaches. There's going to be 500 coaches at the Senior Bowl that would want to coach for the Dallas Cowboys. And he throws things out like that. And it just shows you that he knows how big of a job it still is, even with having to work with Jerry Jones, even with knowing that you're probably not going to get paid with the highest paid coaches in the league. So no, there's still a draw. There's no question about that. I think that there's even a little bit of the whole, like, I noticed it with Mike McCarthy in my time covering him, where you get the feeling that he heard things about Jerry Jones. He's been in the league, coached the Packers. He knew stuff about the Dallas Cowboys. And you think that it's not going to impact you until you get there. And then you find little things along the way where you're like, okay, there's a lot more to this than I originally thought.
Which is why I, as recently as 2 weeks ago, thought Mike McCarthy might just keep the job. Because, again, that's valuable learning experience. 5 years on the job, figuring out how to navigate all the pitfalls of coaching the Cowboys. That's useful. But at the end of the day, it was not enough to keep him in Dallas. And it's dysfunctional, man, but it's always entertaining. I can't wait to see where it goes. And I'll be sure to check in with you as we get more on this front. But I can't tell you how much I appreciate it, Johnny. I'll talk to you soon, man.
Sounds good. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks again to Jon Machota for talking me through the Cowboys coaching search, which promises to be very random and very surprising, if I had to guess. We're going to bring Carmen Vitali back now to talk about another one. And as of right now, the only coaching vacancy that's been filled in 2025. Probably the least surprising head coaching hire that we've seen in quite some time.
Yeah.
It got buried under the Sunday games. I mentioned it in the recap show, but we did want to give it a little bit of air here. The New England Patriots hired Mike Vrabel.
Former New England Patriot.
Just
Mike Vrabel.
Like I said, this felt like it was destined to happen the minute you even heard a whisper that Gerard Mayo might be out. And I think the Patriots process here bears that out. Okay, for starters, if you're not familiar, I mean, Mike Vrabel, legendary Patriots linebacker. He played 8 years there. He helped them win the first 3 of their 6 Super Bowls during that era. Won 54% of his games as head coach of the Titans. Spent 6 years in Tennessee. Made the playoffs half of those years. He was the number 1 overall seed in 2021. Actually, it was his Titans that set the playoff record of 9 sacks against the Cincinnati Bengals.
Yeah.
Somehow managed to lose that game.
Somehow.
Anyway, it's hard to find a more obvious hire than this. Vrabel spent the year with the Browns after getting fired by the Titans. He knows all about the Pats and Robert Kraft. I mean, this just felt like it was destined to happen.
Yeah. And I mean, I think now the further we're getting from his tenure in Tennessee, we're realizing how dysfunctional the Titans are as an organization. Like, they've gotten rid of Rand Carthen now, and they don't really have a direction. And you realize, all right, for all of the issues that they had, Vrabel, for the most part, really kept a lid on him. And you look at this hire in New England now, say what you want about the Gerard Mayo firing. I don't think that they gave him enough of a shot, especially if he was a preordained next head coach and you knew he was coming in. Why wouldn't you give him a longer leash than that, especially with the roster in the state that it was in? And that's a whole separate conversation. But the fact is, the Patriots let Gerard Mayo go and didn't do really much of any sort of actual coaching search. When you talk about, like, they interviewed they interviewed Byron Leftwich, they interviewed Pep Hamilton, and thank you. And like that, neither of those guys had coached in the league since 2022, so you just knew that it was satisfying the Rooney Rule. But that Mike Vrabel was always their guy, and he brings in an already established culture, because I don't think the New England culture, when you grow up in that as a player, really leaves you. At least I think that's what Robert Kraft is hoping. And Vrabel, listen, he's got a big personality. He is a culture type of guy. You know, he's a defensive guy, but he's a CEO head coach. More than the culture stuff, though, and this is kind of the crux of why I thought he was maybe the best coaching candidate of this cycle that New England snapped up. He's proven that he's able to identify coaching talent, because if you look at the first offensive coordinator he brought in Tennessee, it was Matt LaFleur. Well, Matt LaFleur leaves to become the head coach of the Green Bay Packers. He brings in Arthur Smith. Arthur Smith then leaves as a head coach. This is kind of the reality of being a defensive guy, is that your offensive coordinators, if you're good at it, if you're good at bringing them in, they're probably going to leave. But Vrabel his Rolodex is deep. And so when you talk about these culture guys, ones that have to build a culture and are the CEO types, the biggest question mark with guys like that is, who are they bringing in underneath them to be the coordinators? And I don't know that there's a guy that I trust more to do that than Mike Vrabel.
That's what I was going to say. Is I like everything about this other than the way the Patriots did it and what it says about the hiring process.
Yes.
But I'm a little conflicted because, okay, look, the Patriots fired Gerard Mayo the afternoon after they beat the Bills. They fired him on Sunday afternoon, and by Sunday morning of the wild card playoffs, Mike Vrabel had agreed to a deal. So the coaching search, in all essence, was less than a week, basically.
Yes.
A week exactly. You cannot convince me that Robert Kraft didn't have a really good idea that Mike Vrabel was going to be his head coach probably before he officially decided to fire Mayo. Like, if he was going to do it, he was like, all right, this is what we'll do. Like, if I'm firing the heir apparent and the guy that we tapped to replace Bill Belichick,
apparently 5 years ago, by the way,
this is who it would be for. Like, so when the press release went out, this plan had to have already been in motion, which it flies in the face of the Rooney Rule. It flies in the face of trying to include diversity or promote diversity and look everywhere for as many qualified candidates as possible. Obviously, bringing in Byron Leftwich and Pep Hamilton on the same day, and like they made a graphic for it. They were ready to go. You're flying a little fast and loose with the spirit of the rules there. But at the same time, if a proven great head coach has undeniable ties to your franchise, who am I to say that that's not the right guy for the job? Like, I don't blame Robert Kraft for wanting Mike Vrabel to be his coach. I'm with you. I think he should be one of the most coveted coaches of this hiring cycle. Yeah. He wants the job for his ties to New England, and he's got the young, talented quarterback in Drake May. It makes a lot of sense, other than it felt a little cynical to me.
For sure.
But if you're gonna be cynical, at least you are getting such a slam dunk fit like this. So I don't like the way it feels. I don't blame the Patriots for doing it, though.
Yeah, that's fair.
It's just it's a weird little in between, and teams work around the Rooney Rule and they do stuff like this all the time.
They're just not usually as brazen about it.
Yeah.
That's, I think, what makes it feel a little icky. But you're right. This is a great fit all around for both sides. And I really do think that this had been, like you said, a plan that had been in motion for quite some time longer, because you essentially could talk to Vrabel whenever you wanted to, because he was a consultant for the Browns. I don't think that precludes you from talking to other teams if you're not full-time on the payroll. Yeah, I honestly, I thought Vrabel would be a great candidate for the Bears, given all of the culture issues they have there. But I just never saw that as being a real fit with all the red tape you have to get through in that organization. And when the New England job became available, I was like, all right, that dream's dead.
Vrabel might have been a good fit for the Dallas Cowboys as well, given that they clearly want experience. They want proven winners. But they took 8 days to sort things out with Mike McCarthy instead. So it's New England that benefits. They clearly knew what they wanted. They got it. So that is one job filled. So what? That leaves us with the New York Jets still looking for a head coach, the Las Vegas Raiders, the Chicago Bears, the New Orleans Saints, and now the Dallas Cowboys. So
and the Jacksonville Jaguars.
And the Jacksonville Jaguars. I'm so sorry, Jacksonville. I didn't leave you last on purpose. Point being, still plenty of coaching news to get to. We will update you on all of that. And of course, we are about to get ready for the best weekend on the calendar, the divisional round of the playoffs. We will be there on Thursday to preview it all, update you on what we've missed in the meantime. Carmen Vitali, thank you as always. Thank y'all for listening. Make sure you're subscribed. Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you get your pods. Make sure you give us a follow so you're ready for the preview episode. We will talk to you Thursday. Thank you all so much, and I'll talk to you soon.